Hello, and welcome to the background for the Online Data Quality Control Day. I'm Jennifer Stafford, the Director in the Division of Assessment and Accountability Support, and with me today is Helen Jones, the Branch Manager in our division. We welcome you to this background and context presentation. We wanted to give you a little background about all of the work that has happened to prepare our schools and our districts for school accountability and public reporting for the 21-22 school year. In this presentation, we'll discuss the Kentucky Summative Assessment and the alternate Kentucky Summative Assessment and the work teachers and content area experts did to set the standards for student performance of novice, apprentice, proficient, and distinguished on our assessments. Then we'll talk about the accountability standard setting that a group of educators and stakeholders came together to set standards around accountability performance for schools in the indicators as well as the overall color rating. Next, we'll talk about the accountability reporting and what we can look forward to in our public reporting, as well as share data details, as well as some new resources that will help district assessment coordinators communicate about the new accountability system. So I want to turn it over to Helen at this point for the KSA and AKSA standard setting.
Good morning. I'm Helen Jones, and thank you, Jennifer. We want to talk to you a little bit about what has transpired this year. As Jennifer indicated, a lot of work has been taking place here at KDE in preparation for the reporting for the accountability system. So let's talk about some of the activities that have taken place, and we want you to be aware of and that you will need going into preparation for reviewing your data. So we have had a number of activities that has taken place for the Kentucky Summative Assessments as well as the alternate Kentucky Summative Assessments in terms of the standard setting. So just a little bit of background that took place this summer. For the Kentucky Summative Assessment Standard Setting, this took place from July 25th through the 29th. And this is after the first full year, as you know, of an operational assessment administration. The standard setting committee was conducted to provide the cut scores because keep in mind, this is the first time since we have had the new standards that we had to set the cut scores for the mathematics, the reading, social studies, editing mechanics, and on-demand writing. And the editing and mechanics and on-demand writing, those two components are used to give you your combined writing score. We're going to talk a little bit about what that all looks like. Now, in terms of the science, what happened this summer, we just, for the Kentucky Summative Assessment, we did a standards validation, and that also took place this summer. And the purpose of that was to ensure that those cut scores were valid. So we did the standards validation from to ensure that those still were valid for the science. Now for the alternate, again, we had a standard setting for the alternate Kentucky Summative Assessment, and the time period of that was a little different. So we had to establish the cut scores. We brought together a standard setting committee for the same purpose to establish the cut scores for the alternate program. For the and so we had to establish the cut scores for the mathematics, the reading, the social studies, editing mechanics, and on-demand writing. This took place a little earlier in the summer, so we had different dates that to get all of that done. So in June, from June 13th through the 17th, we had the reading and writing. June 20th through the 24th, we had math. July 11th and July 13th for social studies. Now, we did not do a standards validation for the science because they have not changed. Those science scores have not changed. So what we did in order to create a common point of reference, we had to get the we set the cut scores, and it's based on they're translated into a scale. So you'll start to see as you're going through and reviewing your data, you'll see the cut scores and measures performance on the Kentucky Summative Assessments translates into a scale range from 400 to 600 points for all the content areas. Now for the alternate, the scale is from 0 to 30 for reading, mathematics, science, and social studies. So what you'll see, and then there's a difference for the editing and mechanics. So you'll see from 0 to 15 for editing and mechanics for the scores, the scale scores. For the alternate as well as the Kentucky Summative Assessments performance level cut scores, we're going to provide you with you're going to get a number of things that you'll use as you're going through your data. You'll see the identification of the scale scores for the students as well as those performance levels. You're going to get the novice, apprentice, proficient, and distinguished for both the Kentucky Summative Assessments and the alternate on QC Day. What I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about is what you'll see in terms what went into getting that portion of the writing piece of it. So as you know, you're going to get those individual indicator performance level. So we want to spend a little bit of time talking about how we came up with the writing. The combined writing is made up of the on-demand writing as well as the editing and mechanic. So what you're going to see the individual student level scores and performance level will be provided for editing and mechanics and on-demand writing. That's just for the students. So, but there will not be any aggregation of editing and mechanics and on-demand writing for the school level. So let's talk a little bit about what you can expect. And we've got a series of resources to help you as you're going through and seeing this. So for the writing component of the state assessments results for science, social studies, and writing, that indicator uses the combined writing performance level to determine that score. So you'll see the combined writing performance level for the writing component of the state assessments results for this particular indicator for the state assessments result for science, social studies, and writing. The student level or the NAPD for writing will combine the student performance for editing and mechanics and on-demand writing. And this will be, you'll see this in it for the combined writing can be found in a decision matrix table, which we have available in the next slide. So we're going to go through how that happened and what took place and what you can expect to see as you're reviewing the student data. So you're going to use the NAPD point value are combined for the combined writing performance level. That will be included in the accountability for this particular indicator. So let's take a look at this matrix. What we want you to keep in mind, this performance level are determined by the editing and mechanic. So you need both components in order to get your combined writing. So students had to at least done the editing and the mechanics as well as the on-demand writing in order to get a combined writing score. This table, we want you to be mindful that this table represents some guideline described by the panelists to determine the overall writing level, and the influence of the on-demand writing performance level should be greater than the editing and mechanics level. So let's take a look at this matrix. So for instance, if you look along the top, you have the on-demand writing. So we're only looking at the performance levels in order to get the combined writing. And then along the side, you see the editing and mechanics. So given this matrix, let's look a little bit closer. So if, say for instance, on-demand writing, if a student scored a novice on the on-demand writing and a distinguished in the editing mechanic, then the student would receive an apprentice. And by contrast, if a student scored a distinguished on the on-demand writing and say they scored a novice on the editing and mechanics, then they would receive a proficient. So let's talk about how the panelists came up with this. So as we said, we brought together a group of content area expert to set the justification for determining this combined writing matrix. So what they've decided in the determination of the matrix, if the editing and mechanics performance level is the same, say for instance, if they received a on-demand as well as editing and mechanics, if they receive the performance level of, say, proficient, then their score would be proficient. So if the editing and mechanics performance level is the same or one level different from the on-demand writing performance level, then the writing performance level will be the same as the on-demand writing performance level. If the editing and mechanics performance level is 2 levels or greater from the on-demand writing, then the overall performance level would be 1 performance level different from the on-demand writing level in the same direction as the editing and mechanics level. I want to go back so you can kind of see what I mean by that. So say, for instance, if a student had a distinguished on-demand writing and an apprentice on editing and mechanics, they would have a proficient for the combined writing. And we would advise you to refer back to this particular matrix as you're reviewing the data and those spreadsheets that you'll receive as you're going through QC Day. And with that, I'm going to turn it over now to Jennifer to just kind of talk through the entire, a little bit more detail about the accountability standard setting that took place.
Thank you, Helen. Now let's take a look at the accountability standard setting and the group of stakeholders that came together to set the accountability cut scores. In Kentucky, we have a long history of bringing together into a group and very transparent process of bringing together stakeholders across the Commonwealth to provide input and direction on accountability. The standard setting committee that we brought together on September 13th and 14th represented a broad range of the Commonwealth. We brought together stakeholders that looked at performance levels of both the indicators as well as that overall school performance. The indicators, these group of individuals thought very deeply about what it means and what those cut scores are for the indicators between very low and low, low and medium, medium high, and high and very high. They also talked through the cut scores between the overall school performance of red to orange, orange to yellow, yellow to green, and green to blue. So the recommendations that the stakeholders brought forward reflected multiple rounds of analysis of data. The group looked at de-identified data that is real based on the 21-22 school year and the performance in each of those indicators, but the names of the schools were not connected with the data that they looked at. So they had multiple rounds for the indicator as well as the overall performance. They looked first at a process that was facilitated by the Center for Assessment. Brian Gong, Chris Delmaleski, and Laura Pinchot was facilitating the meeting, and they have proprietary spreadsheets that the individuals got to review schools at elementary, middle, and high, and looked at the performance both on the indicators first, and then the next day they looked at the overall. They looked at the data individually first to come to their own understanding and their own thoughts about what performance is by the school. And then after they had a time to think for themselves, then they had a small group discussion at their tables. After the table discussions, there were large group discussions so that they could think collectively and hear different perspectives that were represented in the room. After the large group discussion, there was a time of reflection and the ability for the committee members to have a second round of ratings for themselves. Then again, small group discussion and large group discussion. You can imagine the deeply engaged individuals and their passion that came to the discussions. We had robust conversations, and at times there were differences in opinions, and those differences were respected and heard by the individuals and the groups. In the end, there was an evaluation of the process where 95% of the panelists agreed that, or strongly agreed that the meeting was well organized, that they had appropriate time to reflect and express their opinions. And one of the individuals commented in the SCAC meeting that was held on the 20th, that how she really appreciated all the voices in the room being heard and the respect that everyone received during that process. The Standard Committee was comprised of superintendents, there were assistant superintendents, there were district assessment coordinators, building level principals, principals from the area technology centers, and there were teachers as well as representatives from our K groups. And for the first time, we had a student on the process and deeply involved, as well as our parent representatives were deeply involved as well. And we appreciate all of their rich discussion and the perspectives that they brought to the table, because everyone brought their own viewpoint and had the opportunity to engage in that rich discussion. Now, they started first with the performance level descriptors, and those are ways to describe what it means at those different levels, both for the indicator and the schools, what the performance really means. And they, after setting those goals, those discussion descriptive words on each of those, then they were able to then take those descriptions and take those to what it means for the data. So again, they had the opportunity by indicator on elementary, middle, and high school to set cut points along the way on each of the different performance levels from very low to very high on the indicators. And they had that opportunity to use that spreadsheet to look at the data for each of those schools. For the overall performance, they looked at then using the real data, again, had the opportunity to look at that school level description and what it means at those different levels from red to blue, and had those rich discussions about what it means to be at those different color ratings and that range of performance. So they had the first round, second round, and then after the second round, when there were consensus on the cut scores, the committee members had the opportunity to then, as a large group, discuss if there were any adjustments needed to the cut scores. And for the indicators, there was a tweak found that the supermajority of the committee wanted to make some adjustment to the cuts between very low and low on the indicators. And so as a supermajority, 2/3 of the group agreed then that there needed to be that adjustment made. Now, there was a similar discussion on the overall, but after looking at data and impact data, no adjustments were recommended from the committee. Once the committee had their final approval, they had their days were complete, the 13th and 14th of September, those recommendations were taken to the local superintendent advisory council as well as the Kentucky Department of Education. Statute mandates that the local superintendent advisory council and the Kentucky Department of Education approve the recommended scores. And that's what happened at the September 19th special called meeting of LSAC. Those cut scores were approved in their entirety without any adjustments from that accountability standard setting committee. Once those were approved, the commissioner who represents the department approved those cut scores as well. So now some considerations that the panelists took into their discussions was the fact they were really trying to distinguish performance of schools, and they were looking very deeply at what it means to be at those different performance levels, from very high to very low, and then from red to blue. They wanted to connect the academic indicators for red to the definition of lowest performing schools. So that's where the adjustment came on that first day by the 2/3 supermajority, is that on those academic indicators, they wanted to closely align the lowest performing, that very low, to definitions of lowest performing and that CSI definition from the federal government. They also discussed at length the relationship between the indicators and the overall performance, whether they wanted that close alignment or whether they wanted a more normative approach to the overall score, where it's more like a bell curve. There was a lot of discussion about that relationship, as well as the discussion about English language learners. And because this is such a new indicator for our system, we've not had a English language progress indicator to stand on its own in the past. There was a real desire for the increased performance to be reflected and to be celebrated of the performance of our English learners. So they wanted to really recognize the schools that are growing their English learners in the English language. And there was rich discussion on the performance of schools coming out of and through a global pandemic. They wanted to use obviously the most recent data that we had and really reflect the students' performance as it is currently. So the cut scores for the elementary, middle school by indicator is here for the 21-22 school year for reading and math, science, social studies, and writing, English language progress, as well as the quality of school climate and safety. The middle school also have those same indicators, but as you can see that the cut scores are slightly different by elementary and middle school. And then for high school, I want to pause here for a moment because I want to take some time to really look at these indicators and what those scores and put some context around those scores, because we can say the same thing about the 4 indicators for elementary and middle schools. So if we look at the state assessment results in reading and math, the scale is from 0 to 125. So those scores, as well as the scores from science, social studies, and writing, come from the state assessments. And as we've talked before, students earn points for the schools in the accountability. So if the student were a novice, there's 0 points there. If the student receives an apprentice in either of these content areas, it's a 0.5. If they're proficient, that's the goal, so it's 1.0. And then the distinguished student score is credited for a 1.25. So you can see that the 1.25, that is where we get 125 from. So on average, if all of your students were distinguished, then your score for the state assessment results in reading and math and social studies, science, and writing would be a 125. If on average, then your students were all proficient, it would be 100. So you can see that those scores, 100 and 125, are in that very high range. If your students, however, were on average apprentice, then that score would be a 50. And you would see that the score of 50 for the high school falls in that low range. So hopefully that gives you some context about those score ranges and what they mean and what you can interpret from those scores. For English language progress, there is a scale of 0 to 140. Now, that is a theoretical scale to 140 because none of our schools across any of the levels got up to 140. So there is a theoretical range of 0 to 140, and then there's this practical or effective range that is actually happening. So I want to say that the highest school in English language progress got somewhere in the 70s. So you can see that for English language progress, a score of 70 is in that very high range, even though a 70 is half of the whole entire scale. So again, just a little bit of context around what those ranges mean. For quality of school climate and safety, it's again 0 to 100. The students responded on the survey of strongly disagree, agree, or strongly disagree, and they got points for the school on how they responded to those survey questions. So you can see that a student that rated very or strongly agree got a 1.0. For agree or was 0.66. So you can see that if on average, all of your students strongly agreed, then you would get a very high rating. If they agreed, then it would fall into that high. So you can put some context to those scores by looking at the scales on which the students received points. For post-secondary readiness, which is a high school only indicator, the students who demonstrated readiness in a high demand area got 1.25. If they were ready, they got 1.0. So if all of your students were ready and received that high demand area of readiness, the school then would have a 125 in post-secondary readiness. If all of your students were ready without the high demand, that would be 1.0. That would correlate to 100 for your school. So you can see that that also lands in the very high rating. If half of your students on average were ready and demonstrated those readiness pieces, then that would be about a 50. And you can see that that is in the very low category according to our committee members. And then for graduation rate, if all of your students were graduated, then that would be up at the 100 level. And you can see that the range is from 0 to 100. And notice that the range for very low is 0 to 85.9. So as a reminder, the schools that have a graduation rate lower than 80 is identified as a CSI, or Comprehensive Support and Improvement School. So we have a high range of rate of graduation in our schools. Now, as you look at your scores across these indicators, we hope that you will look at the resources that Helen's going to discuss with you, and then put some context to those scores for your teachers and administrators. Because if they receive a score of 72 on state assessment results in reading and math, you'll want to be able to provide them some indication of what that score means. Now, the overall performance cut rate, you can see that they are from a range of, starts with 0, and the different ranges of blue in the blue category are the scale from elementary, middle, and high schools. Now, you can see that from the ratings that we have red, which is the lowest, orange, yellow is the middle, then your higher level performance schools are the green and the blue. Now, this is a very quick snapshot of the overall performance rating, but the real information comes from those indicators and what those indicators mean. So when you're looking at the overall score, the real story is around those indicators and the performance of your school around those indicators. So it's going to be very important as you communicate about the colors of your schools that you really dig into the real story around what your school performance is and how they got to these different overall ratings. Because the overall ratings does not show the whole picture of the school. When we get to public reporting, you're going to have the opportunity to see those final data that is going to be in the school report card. And that embargoed period is the time that you want to tell your story to the local media. So that they have a better indication of what the school performance is, other than just a quick snapshot of this overall rating. Now, let's look at what will be in the school report card when we get into October. As we've mentioned, there'll be indicator scores. There will be the scores as well as those associated colors of very low to very high, from red to blue, for each of the different indicators based on status only. So as a reminder, these cuts are for this year on status, which is our current year performance. Next year, we'll bring in the component of change, because we'll have 2 years of indicator data. So this year is very similar to what we've done in the past. It's been on status only, and we will report in the fall. Next year, again, we'll bring in that component of change, and we'll go through a similar accountability setting, standard setting. The weights have been shared multiple times. These are approved from the Kentucky Department of Education's board. The Kentucky Board of Education approved these weights, and you can see that these weights used along with the scores of the indicators get and calculate and yield that overall score. So you'd have to take the score of those different indicators, put it together with the weights to get your overall score, and then that leads to your overall color rating. Now, by federal law, the emphasis at elementary and middle schools is reading and math and English language progress. And in high school, the emphasis has to be on reading and math and the graduation rate. So you can see when you combine those at those different levels that the weights are above 51%. So that overall score then will yield the color that was set by those standard setting committee and approved by LSAC and the commissioner. Now, that's all around the state reporting and the state accountability. The federal government has also their federal definitions of school accountability, and that's around comprehensive support and improvement, targeted support and improvement, and additional targeted and support and improvement schools. For fall 2022 reporting, we will identify CSI schools that will begin to be supported in the 22-23 school year. The next identification of CSI schools will be in the fall of 2025. Now, TSI identification, we will identify annually as we have been directed by the department in the fall of 2022. It's going to be based on the 21-22 data due to some interruptions in testing. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that in the next slide. Now, ATSI, Additional Targeted and Support Improvement Schools, they had the opportunity to exit, but they had to demonstrate some growth or increase in those areas that got them identified as ATSI. There are no new ATSI schools identified for fall of 2022. However, there may be a few schools that are identified ATSI because they did not show any growth in those areas. Now, comprehensive support and improvement schools are the bottom 5% of performing schools in each level, elementary, middle, and high, that are in the bottom 5%. So for elementary schools, what we do is it's a very simple calculation. The scores, those overall scores, are ranked from the highest to lowest. When we find the 5% of Title I schools, that's our cut. And then if there are any non-Title I schools that fall below that as well, those schools are identified as CSI. We take the same approach for middle and high school as well. As I mentioned earlier, CSI is also identified for any high school that has a graduation rate below 80%. And then we also have a third category of CSI, and that's those schools that had previously been identified for ATSI and have not exited after 3 years. Now, for targeted support and improvement, the law calls for the school that has a student population that performs as low as that bottom 5% to be identified as TSI. So think about your student demographic group, putting together all of those indicators for that student demographic group as if they were a school, and then they get that overall score for that group. And then if that group falls below that 5%, then that yields a targeted support and improvement school. Now, the law again calls for that to be consecutively, that student group to be the lowest performing for 3 consecutive years. However, due to the waiver that we received from testing in 2020 because of the pandemic, and because we have limited testing in 2021, only 1 year of data will be used for identification of TSI. So obviously that is the 2021 school year performance. So the TSI will be identified annually for our accountability, and we'll continue to use the most data that we can for identification of that TSI using all the information available for our student demographic groups. But again, this year, it's only that 1 year of data. Now, let me turn to Helen to bring some additional data details.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer discussed with you the cut scores, the color rating, as well as the process that took place to get us to this point in terms of the standard setting process and all of the stakeholders that were involved. That being the case, as you prepare for QC Day, there are a couple of things that we want you to be mindful of as you review your data. And we're going to look at this a little bit more in detail so that you'll, as you're going through, you'll have that information. For instance, your minimum N of 30. We're going to talk about that and what that means in terms of the data that you'll see on those spreadsheets that you'll receive. We're going to talk about data that could possibly be suppressed and why. We're going to look at specific student situations. For instance, we're going to be looking at all of our EL students and other students that we need to be considerate of when we're looking at our data. We're going to look at the alternative school trackback, participation rate, those feeder schools, if you have any in your districts, as well as data, the impact of allegation scores and what that can do for your data and the change of your NAPD results or your. So let's kind of get started on what happens with that minimum N of 30 for all students per school or each student group. So for accountability, students in each accountable student demographic group, there must be 30 students per school level per indicator. So per school level, we're talking about the elementary, middle, as well as your high school. So you must have a minimum of 30 students per school level per indicator. That means not per grade level in content, but to be included in the school calculations, you must meet that minimum of 30 per school level per indicator to be included in the school calculation. Kentucky reports by school level. So we report based on if it's elementary school, the middle, and the high school. Now, where this will vary a little bit is on the school report card. We will continue to report the school on the school report card if you have 10 per grade. But for public reporting, we will follow the U.S. Department of Education and FERPA rights for or Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act guidelines for practices for reporting. We've covered the suppression definitions previously, but we want to talk a little bit about and kind of remind you of why some of your data might be suppressed. So you might not see some of your data in the spreadsheets, and this is why. And if that's the case, it will be identified in a red section as you going through your data. So one of the reasons why you may not see your data is, say, for instance, there are situations where students perform all at the same NAPD level. So for instance, if you have all of your Hispanic students performing at proficient, that data may be suppressed. If you have a students that are less than 10, there are fewer students than 10 per grade, and individual students' performance could be determined. Say, for instance, you could determine who are those students that performed, then that data would be suppressed. One other one that I want to draw your attention to is, say, for instance, if you have no students performing at that NAPD level, then in that case, the performance level would be suppressed for that grade level and that subject. As I said earlier, if you have any data that was suppressed, then you would that would be indicated on your spreadsheet. But suppressed data would, but if you really wanted to see there, again, we have identified specific reports that we want you to focus on for QC Day, and that's the accountability as well as the student data folders. But if you want to see that data, suppressed data, it is available for the school and district, but will not be displayed in the school report card, and is not to be shared in public meetings. We cannot stress that enough. So let's look at specific student situations. For English learners, the first year for current English learner indicator, only current year students are included. For all other indicators, both current year ELs and monitored EL students are included in the first year or second year of monitoring. For your early grads, students in the early grad pathway are exempt from the 100-day rules. Early graduates, they must have, according to 704 KAR 3:305, they must have a signed intent and be flagged NIC as an early grad. If a student is in the school for 100 days or more, then the 100-day rule applies. This is another program that you need to be aware of. This is the alternative program and school trackback program. All 100-day rule remain in place except for students who are directly placed in an alternative program without an A1 enrollment in the same year. Direct placement in alternative program code to the district rather than the school unless court ordered or state agency placed, which code to the state. Also, we want you to be mindful that students attending an alternative school for the entire year will track back to the district the school would have attended. Now, this excludes students with secondary enrollments. Say, for instance, if they're in the Gatton Academy, we have also students that are in ILE or Craft, Ignite Academy, as well as students in the Kentucky School for the Blind, and Kentucky School for the Deaf, which tracked back to their A1 homeschool. To determine whether or not students would track back, we advise you to use the 100-day tool to assist with determining accountability. And KDE will also be monitoring this placement as well. The next information we want you to be mindful of is how participation rate is determined. Students with, of course, approved medical non-participation are exempt, as well as your first year EL students are exempt from accountability, but they remain in the denominator for the participation rate. So for participation rate does not affect accountability. It is only required for federal reporting. So as you can see, this is the formula to determine participation rate. It's those number of students that attempted the test versus the number of students that are enrolled. And you need to be mindful that for participation rate, first year ELs are credited as attempting the reading, social studies, editing and mechanics, writing assessments. Now, first year EL students who do not attempt the test could impact participation, negatively impact participation. Within the state of Kentucky, there are a number of feeder schools, and the Every Student Succeeds Act requires an accountability system of annual meaningful differentiation of all public schools, even those that are not tested. So for feeder schools, say you have a feeder school in your district that is, say, a K through 2, that feeder school, even though there's no assessment, but those students actually will attend a assessed school, they would receive the exact same federal classification of that school. So say, for instance, you have an elementary school that is a 3 through 5, and you have a feeder school that's a K through 2. If that elementary 3 through 5 school received a federal classification of, say, a CSI, then that feeder school would also receive that same federal classification. We have tried to put together a number of resources that we hope will be beneficial for you as you prepare for QC Day. So we have the accountability overview training, video and recording. We have also those back to school trainings that go into quite a bit of detail regarding the state indicator, as well as we have the cut scores for you for both KSA and AKSA. We have the overall accountability cut scores, the accountability indicator and overall cut scores. And then there's a tool called with the minimum end. So if you want to look a little bit deeper for that, we have a new tool that we hope will be beneficial. Is the metrics for the school that we put together for you. And these are all linked in this PowerPoint. We also have the QC Day preparation PowerPoint and videos for you to actually assist in preparing for QC Day. This has been a very challenging last 2 years, but you guys have persevered and you have really been there for our students. And as a result, we want to just say thank you so very much for all of your hard work. And we hope that we have prepared you and you're ready for QC Day and to review your data. And we hope you have a good QC Day. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer to see if she wants to have any final words.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you to our district assessment coordinators as you prepare for not only QC Day, but also preparation for our public reporting. As always, if you have questions, please reach out to our division at dacinfo@education.ky.gov. Thank you, and we will see you soon.